rain began softly, a cold mist that clung to the windshield and refused to be wiped away entirely. Alex Duma tightened his grip on the steering wheel, leaning forward as if proximity would improve visibility. The narrow road twisted and turned, hemmed in by a wall of ancient pines that seemed to lean closer the further he drove into the Carpathian wilderness. Somewhere behind him, the faint glow of the last village's lights had disappeared into the gloom. The air had changed. It was colder now, almost unnaturally so, and even with the car heater blowing full force, Alex felt an uncomfortable chill creeping into his bones. The winding, gravel-laden road was a test of nerves. On one side, jagged rock faces loomed like shadowy sentinels, and on the other, steep ravines yawned into darkness. Fog rolled in waves, rising and sinking like a living thing, swallowing the edges of the road and masking what lay beyond. Alex checked the clock on the dashboard. Nearly midnight. He cursed under his breath. His departure from Bucharest had been delayed by a last-minute meeting, leaving him to brave this desolate drive far later than planned. The thought crossed his mind that he should have waited until morning, but impatience had always been his failing. Waiting another day to lay eyes on Bran Castle had been unbearable. Bran, a name steeped in legend and blood, a scholar's obsession. For years, Alex had been chasing rumors, piecing together obscure references and half-truths from dusty archives across Europe. A historian by trade, his interest in Vlad Tepes, the man history remembered as Dracula, had morphed from professional curiosity into something darker, more consuming. His colleagues had dismissed his theories as fanciful at best and delusional at worst. But Alex knew he was close, so close, to uncovering the truth behind the myths. The hidden archives rumored to exist in Bran Castle were the missing piece of the puzzle. If the whispers were true, they contained not only a detailed account of Vlad's atrocities, but also records of rituals performed within the castle walls. Rituals that, according to legend, blurred the line between the living and the dead. The thought sent a thrill through Alex's veins, though he couldn't entirely shake the unease that came with it. He had read the warnings. Every source he had consulted, be it scholarly or folkloric, spoke of the castle as a place of shadows, where the past refused to remain buried. Yet, he had dismissed such warnings as superstition. Now, with the forest closing in around him, he wasn't so sure. Whispers in the village. The last village he passed through had been a bleak collection of cottages huddled together, as if for warmth. The air had smelled of damp earth and wood smoke, and the few villagers who braved the rain had watched him with wary eyes. At a gas station on the outskirts, an elderly attendant had refused to fill his tank until Alex answered a barrage of questions about his destination. Bran Castle, Alex had said, trying to keep his tone light. The old man's face had darkened immediately. He shook his head and muttered something in Romanian. "What did you say?" Alex asked, leaning closer. "Numărgeti acolo," the man said, voice low. "Do not go there." Alex forced a smile, though his unease was growing. "I'll be fine, thanks. It's just research. I'm a historian." The man had shaken his head again, this time more emphatically. "The castle, it is not just a place. It is a hunger. You cannot satisfy it. It takes, and it does not give back." Alex had thanked him quickly and left, dismissing the old man's words as the product of local superstition. But now, with the dark road stretching endlessly ahead of him and the oppressive silence pressing in, those words returned unbidden to the forefront of his mind. The forest's warning. The radio, which had been playing static-laden classical music earlier, sputtered and died. Alex reached over to adjust the dial, but the knob only spun uselessly. A heavy silence filled the car, broken only by the rhythmic thud of rain against the roof. It wasn't until he turned off the radio entirely that he realized something was missing. The sound of the wind. For miles, it had howled through the trees, a constant accompaniment to the rain. Now it was gone, leaving an unnatural stillness that set Alex's teeth on edge. He cracked the window slightly, letting in a rush of cold, damp air. There was no breeze, no rustling of leaves, only the faint scent of wet earth and pine. His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. The taillights cast a dim red glow, but beyond there was only darkness. Still, He couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was out there. When he turned his attention back to the road, his stomach lurched. A figure stood ahead, barely visible through the fog. Alex slammed the brakes, the car skidding slightly before coming to a halt. The figure didn't move. It was a man, dressed in dark clothing, his face obscured by the shadows. For a moment, Alex considered rolling down the window to call out, but something stopped him. The figure's stillness was wrong, unnatural. The man raised one arm slowly, pointing into the woods. Alex's pulse quickened. He couldn't see where the man was pointing, just a wall of black trees shrouded in mist. The figure held the pose for several seconds before lowering his arm and stepping back into the shadows, vanishing as suddenly as he had appeared. Heart pounding, Alex sat frozen in his seat. Had it been real? Or had exhaustion and nerves gotten the better of him? He shook his head and forced himself to keep driving. But as he passed the spot where the man had stood, a chill ran down his spine. The trees there seemed darker, more gnarled, as if scorched by some unseen fire. The first glimpse of Bran. After what felt like hours, the forest began to thin, and Alex caught his first glimpse of the castle. It rose abruptly from the landscape, perched atop a jagged hill like a predator, surveying its domain. Lightning illuminated its silhouette, momentarily revealing the jagged towers and steep, slate-covered roofs. The sight was both awe-inspiring and deeply unsettling, as if the castle itself were alive and watching his approach. Alex pulled into a small, gravel-covered lot at the base of the hill. The rain had subsided to a fine drizzle, and the air was deathly quiet. He grabbed his bag from the passenger seat and stepped out, shivering as the cold bit into his skin. The path to the castle was narrow and steep, winding through thick underbrush that seemed to close the higher he climbed. The stone steps were slick with rainwater, forcing him to tread carefully. Each step echoed unnaturally, the sound swallowed by the oppressive silence. Halfway up, he paused to catch his breath, glancing over his shoulder. The village lights were faint specks in the distance, barely visible through the mist. For the first time since beginning his journey, Alex felt truly alone. The castle's threshold. The castle gates loomed ahead, massive and ironbound, etched with runes that Alex couldn't decipher. As he reached out to push them open, a gust of wind swept through the courtyard, carrying with it a low, almost inaudible whisper. It sounded like his name. He froze, staring into the darkness beyond the gates. Somewhere, deep within the castle, a faint light flickered. Gathering his courage, Alex stepped inside, unaware that the gates were slowly closing behind him. The castle revealed. Alex Duma stood in the shadow of Bran Castle, his breath misting in the frigid night air. The storm clouds overhead parted just enough for the moon to cast a silvery light over the ancient fortress. Lightning followed moments later, briefly illuminating the jagged spires and steep, slate-covered roofs. The castle looked alive in the storm, its silhouette grotesque and imposing, a testament to centuries of violence and suffering. Every detail of the structure seemed designed to repel visitors. The walls were rough-hewn stone, mottled with creeping ivy and blackened patches where it seemed fire had once licked the surface. Tall, narrow windows glared down like unblinking eyes, their glass reflecting the storm's electric brilliance. Alex felt a strange tightness in his chest as he gazed at the imposing structure. His rational mind dismissed it as exhaustion from the long drive. But a deeper part of him, one he wasn't ready to acknowledge, felt an inexplicable dread. He adjusted the strap of his bag, its familiar weight grounding him, and started toward the front gates. The iron gates stood ajar, creaking faintly as the wind pushed them back and forth. They were ancient, etched with patterns that looked like runes or archaic symbols. Alex ran his fingers across the cold metal as he passed, noting how the edges of the carvings felt worn, as if touched by countless hands over the centuries. First steps inside. The courtyard beyond was dimly lit by a single lantern, hanging from a wrought iron bracket near the main doors. The uneven cobblestones glistened with rainwater, and Alex had to tread carefully as he approached. Around him, the castle loomed on all sides, its jagged architecture a testament to centuries of expansion and decay. Towering walls encased the space, creating an oppressive, almost suffocating sense of enclosure. To the right, a twisted tree clawed at the sky, its leafless branches gnarled and blackened. Beneath it lay a crumbled stone fountain, its basin dry and choked with moss. On the far left, a stable door hung askew, the darkness beyond it impenetrable. Alex felt eyes on him, though he saw no one. The main entrance was a set of heavy oak doors bound with iron. He hesitated before pushing them open, half expecting resistance, but they swung inward with surprising ease, revealing a grand, dimly lit hall beyond. The groundskeeper appears. The air inside was colder than the stormy night outside. Alex stepped forward, his boots echoing on the stone floor, and set his bag down by his feet. The space was vast, its vaulted ceiling disappearing into shadows. A chandelier hung high above, its candles flickering weakly, as if reluctant to dispel the darkness. The walls were lined with faded tapestries, their once vivid colors now muted and ghostly. Alex turned in a slow circle, taking in the room. He noticed the faint scent of mildew and something more metallic. Iron or rust, he thought. Then came the sound of footsteps, deliberate and slow, approaching from a corridor to his right. "Good evening." The voice was low and gravelly, startling Alex, who spun around to face its source. A man stood in the archway, leaning heavily on a wooden cane. His shoulders were hunched, his frame gaunt beneath a threadbare coat that looked as old as the castle itself. His face was a map of wrinkles, deep grooves carved into his cheeks and forehead. Pale eyes glimmered from beneath bushy brows, sharp and calculating. "You must be Mihai," Alex said, recovering his composure. He extended a hand, though the gesture felt almost absurd in the circumstances. The old man didn't take it. Instead, he gave Alex a slow, deliberate once-over before nodding. "And you are the scholar?" Alex dropped his hand, smiling awkwardly. "That's right, Alex Duma. Thank you for allowing me access to the castle. I know it's not open to the public this time of year." Mihai chuckled, a sound that was more rasp than laugh. "Not much of a public these days, and fewer still who would dare come here after dark. But you," he trailed off, shaking his head as if in disapproval. "You have the look of one who seeks answers to questions best left unasked." Cryptic warnings. Alex frowned. "I'm here to study the castle's history, its connection to Vlad Tepes and the surrounding folklore. That's all." Mihai's expression didn't change. "Ah, Vlad," he said, his voice heavy with sarcasm. "The Impaler, the Dragon Prince. So much blood spilled, and still, they speak of him as if he were the only monster to walk these halls." Alex raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What do you mean?" The old man tapped his cane on the floor, the sound echoing sharply. "This castle is older than Vlad, older than the stones you stand on. The stories you know are only fragments, pieces of a puzzle too vast, too terrible to comprehend. You won't find the answers you seek here, scholar, only more questions." The cryptic tone was beginning to wear on Alex's nerves. "I've come a long way, Mihai," he said, his voice firm. "If there's something I should know, I'd appreciate you telling me outright." Mihai's pale eyes narrowed. For a moment, Alex thought the old man might refuse to say more, but then he gestured toward a staircase at the far end of the hall. "Your room is on the second floor," he said. "Third door on the left. You'll find it warm enough, though I doubt you'll sleep much." Alex hesitated. "Why wouldn't I sleep?" Mihai smirked, revealing yellowed teeth. "The castle has a way of getting inside your head. You'll see soon enough. A deeper mystery." As Mihai turned to leave, Alex called after him. "Wait, you didn't answer my question earlier. What did you mean about other monsters?" The old man paused in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the flickering torchlight beyond. For a moment, he seemed to weigh his words carefully. "There are things in this world," he said finally, "that are neither living nor dead. Things that feed on fear, on blood, on the very essence of what makes us human. Vlad knew this, though he dared to think he could control it. He was a fool." With that, Mihai disappeared into the shadows, leaving Alex alone in the vast, empty hall. The castle breathes. Alex stood in silence, the old man's words reverberating in his mind. He couldn't decide whether Mihai was senile, superstitious, or simply trying to unnerve him. Whatever the case, the atmosphere in the castle was oppressive, as if the very stones were watching him. He retrieved his bag and made his way to the staircase, his footsteps echoing ominously. The steps were worn smooth by centuries of use, their edges rounded and uneven. As he climbed, the air grew colder, and he became acutely aware of how isolated he was. Reaching the second floor, Alex found himself in a narrow corridor lined with heavy wooden doors. Most were closed, but one stood slightly ajar, revealing a glimpse of a darkened room beyond. He shivered and quickly counted the doors until he reached the third on the left, the room awaiting him. The door creaked as Alex pushed it open. Inside, a modest chamber awaited him. A single bed, covered in a thick woolen blanket, sat against the far wall. A small writing desk stood beneath a narrow window, its surface cluttered with unlit candles and a tarnished inkwell. The window overlooked the courtyard below, now almost completely obscured by fog. Alex set his bag down and crossed to the desk, lighting one of the candles with a match. The flame flickered weakly, casting long shadows that danced across the walls. As he turned to close the door, Alex froze. Faintly, from somewhere deep within the castle, he heard it, a low, resonant sound, like a distant groan. He listened intently, but it didn't repeat. Shaking his head, he told himself it was just the wind. But as he lay down to rest, Mihai's words echoed in his mind. The castle has a way of getting inside your head. The first night, the chamber was deathly quiet, the kind of silence that seemed unnatural, almost oppressive. Alex lay on the narrow bed, staring at the dark wooden beams above him. Despite the heavy woolen blanket pulled tightly around his body, the cold still found a way to creep into his bones. The castle's chill was not merely a lack of warmth. It felt alive, seeping into his skin, burrowing deeper with every passing minute. The single candle on the desk had burned low, casting a flickering glow that barely illuminated the room. Shadows danced on the stone walls, shifting with the faint movement of the flame. Alex had always considered himself a rational man, but in that moment, he found himself wondering whether the shadows moved too much, as if responding to something unseen. He shook the thought away. Exhaustion was playing tricks on his mind. After all, it had been a grueling day. The long drive, the unsettling encounter with Mihai, and the oppressive atmosphere of the castle itself. It was no wonder his nerves were frayed. Still, he couldn't sleep. The footsteps. Somewhere in the distance, a faint sound broke the silence. Alex sat up, straining to hear. For a moment, all he could make out was the soft patter of rain against the narrow window. Then it came again, light, deliberate footsteps echoing from the corridor outside his door. His pulse quickened. He stared at the door, half expecting it to swing open at any moment. But it remained closed, the heavy wooden surface unyielding. "It's Mihai," Alex whispered to himself, his voice barely audible. He's probably checking on the castle. But even as he said it, he wasn't convinced. The footsteps were too light, almost hesitant, as if the person or thing on the other side of the door was unsure of its own presence. The sound grew louder, moving closer. Alex's grip tightened on the blanket. He wanted to call out, to demand to know who was there, but his voice caught in his throat. Instead, he reached for his phone, fumbling to unlock it. The device's harsh light flooded the room, a stark contrast to the dim candlelight. No service. Of course not. The castle's thick walls probably blocked any signal, and the storm outside wasn't helping. Alex set the phone down, his hands trembling slightly. The footsteps had stopped, just outside his door. The breeze. A sudden draft swept through the room, extinguishing the candle in an instant. Alex gasped, plunging into total darkness. The cold breeze carried with it an unfamiliar scent, earthy and metallic, like damp soil mingled with iron. He glanced toward the window, but it was shut tight. The breeze hadn't come from outside. Alex's heart raced as he scanned the room, his eyes slowly adjusting to the darkness. He thought he saw movement in the far corner, a faint ripple in the shadows. Swallowing hard, he forced himself to speak. "Is someone there?" His voice echoed slightly, swallowed by the oppressive silence that followed. The reply was not immediate. It came after several agonizing seconds, soft and distant, muffled voices, barely perceptible, like a conversation held just out of earshot. The words were unintelligible, but the tone was unmistakable, pleading. Alex's throat tightened. He swung his legs over the side of the bed and stood, his bare feet touching the cold stone floor. "Mihai," he called, louder this time. The voices stopped. The whisper. Alex took a cautious step toward the door, every instinct telling him to stay put. The floor creaked beneath his weight, the sound startlingly loud in the stillness. He paused, listening intently. Then he heard it, a whisper, directly behind him. The voice was soft, almost intimate, but it carried a sharp edge that sent shivers racing down Alex's spine. It spoke in a language he didn't understand, Romanian, perhaps, but older, harsher. The syllables hissed and clicked, forming a cadence that felt wrong, unnatural. Alex spun around, his back pressing against the door. The room was empty. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice cracking. No answer came. The whispering stopped as abruptly as it had started. Alex's gaze darted around the chamber, searching for any sign of movement. The shadows seemed deeper now, darker and more oppressive. He could feel his pulse pounding in his ears, the adrenaline coursing through his veins. The door moves. His hand fumbled for the iron latch of the door behind him. He needed to get out, to find Mihai, to confirm he wasn't losing his mind. But as he moved to open it, the door shuddered. Alex froze. The door creaked, not from his touch, but as if something on the other side had pressed against it. The latch rattled faintly, as though someone, or something, was trying to open it. "Hello," Alex whispered, his voice barely audible. A loud thump struck the door, causing him to jump back. The sound reverberated through the chamber, breaking the stillness like a gunshot. Alex stumbled, falling onto the bed behind him. For several agonizing moments, the door remained still. Then, slowly, the latch lifted, and the door creaked open an inch. Alex stared at the gap, his breath caught in his throat. He saw nothing but darkness beyond. The figure in the hall, summoning what little courage he had left. Alex grabbed his phone and turned on its flashlight. The bright beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the empty corridor. He stepped cautiously to the doorway, the light trembling in his unsteady hand. The hallway stretched on in both directions, its walls lined with faded portraits and cracked stone. At first, Alex saw no one, but as he swept the light further down the hall, he froze. A figure stood at the far end. It was tall and shrouded in a dark cloak, its face obscured by shadow. The figure didn't move, didn't react to the beam of light shining directly at it. Alex's mouth went dry. "Who are you?" he managed to croak. The figure remained silent, but its head tilted slightly, as if studying him. Alex took an involuntary step back, his grip tightening on the phone. The light flickered, dimmed, and then went out completely. "No, no, no," Alex whispered, frantically pressing buttons, but the phone refused to turn back on. He was plunged once again into complete darkness. The room changes. Alex stumbled back into his room, slamming the door shut and sliding the iron latch into place. His breathing was ragged, his heart hammering against his ribs. He pressed his back against the door, straining to hear any sound from the hallway. Nothing. For a moment, he allowed himself to believe it was over, that the figure, whatever it was, had gone. But as he turned back toward the room, his stomach dropped. The chamber was different. The bed was gone, replaced by a rough wooden slab stained dark with something he didn't want to think about. The desk had vanished, and in its place stood a tall iron candelabra, its twisted branches holding faintly glowing candles. Worst of all, the walls seemed to pulse, the stones themselves alive with faint, rhythmic movement. Alex stumbled back, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. "This isn't real," He whispered, "I'm dreaming. I have to be dreaming." The presence. A low, guttural sound filled the room, like a growl mixed with the scraping of stone. It came from everywhere and nowhere at once, reverberating in Alex's chest. He turned slowly, his eyes wide with terror. A shadow detached itself from the far corner of the room, shifting and growing until it loomed over him. 2 pinpricks of red light appeared where eyes should have been, burning with a malevolent intelligence. Alex backed away, his legs weak beneath him. "What do you want?" he whispered. The shadow didn't answer, but the red eyes narrowed. Alex felt an overwhelming sense of pressure, as if the air itself were being sucked from the room. He fell to his knees, gasping for breath. As his vision blurred, the shadow advanced, its form becoming more defined. He could make out twisted limbs, claws that scraped against the stone floor, and a face that was both human and monstrously wrong. Just as the creature reached him, Alex screamed, and everything went black.